Rome AD 65. The city was a living monument to ambition and fear. Marble arches cut white against the sky. Columns loomed like forest trunks turned to stone. The gold leaf on the Senate doors caught the sun, as if the gods themselves had pressed their fingers there. Beneath the grandeur, the streets pulsed with something restless, an undercurrent of whispered rumors, and glances too quick to hold. The people walked fast, not because their errands were urgent, but because in this Rome lingering could be dangerous. On the Palatine Hill, where the emperor's palace spread like an entire city of its own, the air was heavier. Perfumed smoke from imported incense curled in slow spirals, mingling with the scent of oil lamps and the metallic tang of freshly polished bronze. Servants moved silently along corridors, as long as rivers, their sandals barely whispering against the mosaic floors. Each step echoed the truth no one dared speak aloud. Here, beauty was not the opposite of cruelty. It was its mask. And at the center of this mask, behind layers of silk curtains and guarded doors, lived a boy who had been promised a crown. His name was whispered with the weight of lineage, a child marked for imperial destiny. The sort whose portrait was commissioned before his voice had even settled. Yet he was no longer the boy Rome had once known. Those who caught a rare glimpse said his face had changed, not aged, but hollowed. The softness of youth had been sculpted into something deliberate, as though grief and fear had conspired to carve him into a new shape. The Emperor Nero Claudius Caesar was the sun around which all things turned, and this boy was caught in that gravity. Rome believed it knew the story, that the emperor, in a moment of unpredictable mercy, had taken the boy under his protection after tragedy struck. But those who lived closest to the throne knew the truth was far darker, twisted into something neither love nor mercy could explain. Nero had not merely claimed the boy's loyalty. He had remade him, reshaped him in both flesh and name, as though reality itself bent under the emperor's will. The story began as most tragedies do, with love turned to ash. Poppaea Sabina, Nero's empress, had been Rome's living jewel, radiant, calculating, impossible to ignore. Her death, sudden and brutal, left a void in the imperial chambers, a vacuum that devoured reason. Grief twisted Nero into something unrecognizable, and into that void he pulled the boy Sporus as if to fill the space Poppaea had left behind. History will tell you that Nero married him, that the boy barely past childhood was forced into the role of a dead woman, that an entire empire bowed its head and called this union holy, because to do otherwise was to invite death. But this is not merely a tale of a tyrant's madness. It is about the silent machinery that allows madness to stand unchallenged. It is about the eyes that look away, the mouths that shape lies into ritual, the hands that dress a boy in bridal veils, while the empire applauds. It is about the way power, once absolute, can take not only a person's freedom, but their very self, until the only act of rebellion left is to refuse to exist at all. The year now is 68 AD, and the city is holding its breath. Nero's reign teeters on the brink, the Senate restless, the generals whispering. The boy, no longer a boy, not yet a man, stands in the shadow of a fate he has carried for too long. He has worn the crown meant for another, lived in a body not entirely his own, been a puppet in a theater whose stage was marble and blood. And he knows what happens to puppets when the strings are cut. The choice before him is not whether to live as himself. That choice was taken years ago. The choice is whether to endure the final humiliation of survival under yet another master, or to step into the one space where no emperor, no senate, no soldier can follow. This is the story of the prince who chose death over the crown, a story of Rome's most intoxicating and terrible power, not its legions, not its wealth, but its ability to make the impossible seem inevitable. To speak of the prince's fate is to speak of the architecture of power itself. Rome in the time of Nero was not merely a city, it was a living organism whose lifeblood was control. Every marble column was a bone, every senator a nerve, and at its heart beat a ruler whose whims could redraw the boundaries of reality. The prince's life unfolded in the shadow of a truth. Rome rarely admitted the crown was not always a gift. Sometimes it was a chain forged in public ceremony, but tightened in private rooms. For Sporus, though, that name itself was a kind of theft. This chain was made from the grief and obsession of a man who could command the world, yet could not command the return of his wife. Nero's love for Poppaea was not gentle. It was consuming a possession so total that even her death could not loosen its grip. And so, he reached for a cruel alchemy to transform another into her image, to replace absence with imitation. The themes that rise from this act are not confined to Rome's ancient walls. They are eternal patterns of human ambition and fear. The corruption of power is the first and most obvious. It is one thing to order the death of an enemy. Rome understood this as the cost of empire. It is another to dismantle a person from the inside, to claim their body, their name, their reflection, and remake them to suit your longing. Here, power does not kill, outright it erases, and then writes itself over the blank space. The second theme is the mutation of grief into obsession. Nero's mourning was not a private ache. It was a performance, one that demanded the participation of the entire empire. The court became a stage on which the emperor's refusal to accept loss played out in rituals, banquets, and whispered instructions to tailors and jewelers. Sporus's body was the canvas. The imperial jewelers shaped rings for his hands. The seamstresses stitched garments meant for a dead empress. And all the while, Rome learned to look at him and pretend to see her. Control over identity becomes the third current in this dark tide. In Rome, a name was more than a word. It was lineage, history, destiny. To strip a man of his name and give him another was to sever him from himself. Sporus's transformation was not metaphorical. It was the deliberate restructuring of who he was allowed to be. His reflection no longer belonged to him. Even his voice, altered by the emperor's command, became a weapon of obedience. And then, there is the machinery that makes such cruelty possible. The senators who nodded in approval, the guards who enforced the emperor's wishes, the servants who dressed the boy without meeting his eyes. They were not powerless. They were the gears in the machine. In Rome, survival often meant complicity. A single act of defiance could mean not only your death, but the death of your entire family. And so, silence became the most common language of the imperial court. What is most chilling is how swiftly the unnatural became ritual. Rome was an empire built on spectacle. It knew how to dress cruelty in gold. The wedding of Nero and Sporus was not whispered in shame. It was displayed in public, with priests chanting blessings, and the populace told to cheer. There is a peculiar genius in a power so great, it can force people to applaud their own degradation. The prince's tragedy is therefore not just personal, it is structural. He was caught between two forces that devoured him from opposite ends: the emperor's obsessive need to control, and the empire's collective willingness to sustain that control in exchange for stability. His own desires were irrelevant. In the logic of Rome, the individual was clay, and the state embodied in its ruler was the potter. This story becomes even more brutal when you see its inevitability. Nero's downfall did not free Sporus, it merely shifted his chains to other hands. Each new ruler saw him as a political symbol, a curiosity, a prize to display or discard. There was no path back to the boy he had been. The crown that had once been promised to him was no longer a gift, no longer even a possibility. It had become the symbol of everything stolen from him. And so, when the final choice came, when survival meant playing the role of someone else's puppet yet again, the prince's decision was not cowardice. It was the only act left that belonged to him alone. The tragedy of the prince unfolds on two levels: the historical and the symbolic. The facts recorded in the writings of Suetonius, Cassius Dio, and Tacitus give us the bones. But history's dry language can never fully capture the phantom breath of what happened behind closed marble doors. The quiet gasps of a person being erased. For that, we must look beneath the surface into the world of symbols, a world this story drags behind it like a shadow. At its core, the transformation of Sporus is an allegory of the erasure of self under tyranny. His body became the property of an empire, his reflection a tool in the emperor's theater of denial. This was not a simple disguise. It was the systematic annihilation of identity, a place where the subject is forced to become the mirror image of the ruler's will. In this way, Sporus's life became a cautionary tale of what happens when power ceases to govern and instead begins to dictate reality itself. The imperial court, for all its gold and grandeur, was a stage where truth was forbidden. In this theater, masks were more important than faces, and a lie repeated in marble halls became indistinguishable from the truth. Sporus was not just forced to wear a bridal veil. He was compelled to live beneath it, to breathe through the suffocating silk of a false narrative, spun by the most dangerous playwright in Rome. His existence was a performance with no closing curtain, where the penalty for breaking character was death. In the symbolic language of this tragedy, mirrors become a central motif. Each time Sporus looked into polished bronze or the still surface of a fountain, he confronted a face that was both his and not his. The mirror reflected the craftsmanship of imperial power, every contour shaped to mimic a lost empress, every gesture rehearsed until it was no longer imitation, but second nature. Yet somewhere, in the locked chambers of his mind, the boy he once was must have raged against that reflection. The mirror became both his jailer and his last tenuous connection to the truth. Masks were equally omnipresent. Not only the literal veils of ceremony, but the invisible ones worn by everyone around him. The senators who smiled through clenched teeth, the servants who pretended not to see, the emperor himself, who masked his cruelty as devotion. In this sense, the court was not unlike a troupe of actors, each playing a part written for them by fear, each complicit in maintaining the illusion. The tragedy was that Sporus's mask was nailed to his skin. There was no intermission in which he could remove it. And then there were the puppet strings, another recurring image in this narrative. In Rome, power was often compared to a divine force, but in truth, it behaved more like a master, pulling cords from behind a curtain. Sporus's every movement, every word, was tugged into place by an unseen hand. The illusion of autonomy was perhaps the cruelest joke. He could walk the marble corridors, attend banquets, even speak to the Senate. But each of these actions had been scripted for him in advance. His body was the stage, and he himself was the prop. The relationship between Nero and Sporus, stripped of its imperial trappings, becomes a political statement as much as a personal tragedy. It declared in the language of power that the emperor could defy nature, custom, and dignity without consequence. It was a warning to the empire: if the ruler could remake a prince into an empress, then there was nothing he could not do. It was the ultimate demonstration that the state's power extended beyond law, beyond life, into the very boundaries of identity. Yet, within this theater of domination, there remains an unspoken countercurrent, the idea that the spirit can survive, even the erasure of the self. In the final act of his life, Sporus made a choice that shattered the script. The puppet cut his own strings, the mirror shattered in defiance. The mask fell from his face. Death in this moment became not an end, but a reclamation, a final refusal to perform in the emperor's endless play. The story of the prince is not confined to the marble ruins of ancient Rome. Its symbols, the mirror, the mask, the puppet strings still exist in our modern world, though the materials have changed. Where once it was silk veils and gold-threaded robes, now it is digital screens, public narratives, and the curated images of power. The mechanics of control have evolved, but the psychology behind them remains the same. In the imperial court of Nero, reality was rewritten by decree. Today, reality can be rewritten by repetition, by amplification, and by the steady erosion of truth. Sporus's enforced identity was an extreme example of what happens when the powerful dictate not just actions, but perception itself. In our time, this may take the form of political leaders who craft alternate realities for their nations, corporate structures that shape how employees must think and speak, or social systems that demand individuals suppress their true selves in order to survive. The masks have not disappeared. They have simply grown more subtle. The corruption of power in Sporus's story is not simply a warning about tyrants. It is a warning about the environment that sustains them. Nero's will would have been impossible to enforce without the complicity of senators, generals, and citizens who learned to applaud what they knew was a lie. In the present day, this translates into the silent nods in boardrooms, the empty applause in political rallies, the just following orders that echoes through history. Systems of control are rarely maintained by one man's cruelty alone. They thrive on the passivity of the many. Sporus's tragedy also forces us to examine the cost of survival under such systems. In ancient Rome, defiance was often a death sentence. In our own era, defiance can cost a career, a reputation, or even one's safety. The question his life leaves us with is whether a life lived entirely under the mask is truly life at all. This is not a question to answer lightly. It demands we confront the value we place on dignity, autonomy, and the ability to define ourselves. The manipulation of identity, which in Sporus's case was literal and physical, also speaks to more pervasive forms of erasure in our world. Marginalized voices are often forced to adopt the language, appearance, or values of the dominant culture to gain access or protection. Entire communities are expected to perform roles assigned to them by those in power, much as Sporus was made to perform the role of a dead empress. This is not merely a matter of aesthetics. It is the slow, grinding away of selfhood until the performance becomes indistinguishable from the person. And then there is the final act, the refusal to continue the performance, even at the cost of one's life. In our time, this need not always mean literal death. It can mean leaving an abusive relationship, walking away from a job that demands the destruction of one's integrity, or speaking a forbidden truth in a place where silence is expected. These acts carry their own risks, but they are the modern equivalents of cutting the puppet strings. The prince's choice reminds us that the ultimate power any person retains, even in the face of overwhelming control, is the choice of how and when to say no. And yet, his life also warns that such choices are never made in a vacuum. They are shaped by the structures, pressures, and dangers that surround us. Understanding this balance between personal agency and systemic force is essential. If we are to recognize and resist similar patterns in our own time, it is easy to read the prince's story and imagine that we would have acted differently, that we would have been the lone senator who spoke out, the servant who refused to participate, the citizen who saw through the illusion. But history's weight tells us otherwise. More often than not, the machinery of control functions precisely because people like us keep it running. The first step toward breaking it is the willingness to see it. The last chapter of the prince's life unfolded, not in the marble glare of the imperial palace, but in the quiet, airless space where the corridors of power end. By the year 68 AD, Nero's sun was collapsing into itself. Rebellion stirred in the provinces. The Senate sharpened its knives behind closed doors, and the Praetorian Guard, once his shield, shifted its allegiance to a man who promised stability. The palace, once alive with feasts and music, grew tense with the smell of betrayal. For Sporus, the fall of Nero should have been a liberation. But history rarely grants freedom to those who have been remade by another's will. With the emperor gone, he did not return to the boy he once was. That boy had been buried long ago under layers of silk, ceremony, and survival. Instead, he became a living token passed from one man's ambition to another's. Each successor in Rome's chaotic power struggle seeing him not as a person, but as a relic of the last reign, a curiosity, a weapon, a piece of theater to be used. The final humiliation came when a new ruler sought to replay the spectacle of his life for the amusement of the court. In that moment, Sporus saw the full circle of his fate. He would forever be the emperor's phantom bride, no matter whose hands pulled the strings. And so, in an act that was both surrender and rebellion, he stepped beyond their reach entirely. He chose the only form of self-definition left to him. He chose death. His decision reverberates through time, not as a quiet footnote in Roman history, but as a final, shattering note in a symphony of power, control, and identity. It was the moment the puppet cut its own strings. The mask slipped, and the mirror cracked beyond repair. Death for Sporus was not merely an escape. It was the reclamation of something Rome had long denied him, the right to decide who he was. And so the story of the prince who chose death over the crown is more than an ancient tragedy. It is a mirror we are still forced to look into, a reminder of how easily power can dress cruelty in beauty. How the machinery of control depends not only on the tyrant, but on the silent consent of those who serve him. It asks us to see the masks we wear today, those we have been handed, those we have been forced to craft for survival, and to question whether we can live our lives entirely behind them, without losing the essence of who we are. This is the call that remains, to recognize the patterns before they bind us, to listen for the subtle tug of strings before they tighten. In our time, the crown may not be made of gold, the palace may not be built of marble, but the forces that reshaped Sporus are still alive in boardrooms, in politics, in families, in the unspoken rules of cultures that demand obedience before authenticity. To resist them is not a single act, but a way of living. It is in choosing again and again to keep even the smallest corner of ourselves untouchable, unremade, unclaimed. And when the moment comes, because it always comes when the performance demanded of us becomes unbearable, we must decide whether to keep breathing within the confines of the mask, or to step beyond it, whatever the cost. The prince's final act was both a tragedy and a triumph. It leaves us with a truth that should haunt us. Dignity is not always found in survival, and sometimes the only way to reclaim your life is to decide when and how it ends. In the echo of his story, you must decide what you will do when the crown is offered not as a gift, but as a chain. Will you bow your head and wear it? Or will you find the courage, however quietly, however defiantly, to set it down?